She remembered exactly what you said, and you don't even remember saying it. That is not a small thing. That is actually the whole story, hiding in plain sight. Because somewhere in the last week, maybe the last few days, you said something ordinary to you, something you probably filed away as small talk or filler or just the natural end of a moment. And she held on to it. She turned it over. She thought about it later, maybe lying in bed, maybe in the middle of something else entirely, and she could not quite explain why it stayed with her. You will never know that happened. That is what makes this so easy to miss. Most men assume that attraction is built through grand gestures or carefully constructed lines. It is not. It is built, quietly, invisibly, through specific patterns in ordinary language, patterns that certain men use naturally, patterns that land somewhere deep in a woman's psychology before she has even had time to analyze them. By the end of this video, you are going to know exactly what those patterns are, not as theory, as something you can recognize in conversations you have already had, and use with full awareness in every conversation that comes next. There is a version of this that younger men simply cannot access. Not because they are less intelligent and not because they lack confidence in some broad, indefinable way. It is more specific than that. The way a man speaks changes with age, and those changes happen to align almost precisely with what the female brain is wired to respond to most strongly. When a woman is processing a conversation, her brain is doing something men often underestimate. She is not just listening to the content of what is being said. She is running a simultaneous filter, evaluating tone, certainty, emotional texture, and dozens of microsignals that tell her something about who this person is beneath the surface of their words. That filter did not develop arbitrarily. It developed over millennia of women needing to assess very quickly whether a man was reliable, grounded, and worth further attention. The interesting thing is what triggers that filter versus what bypasses it. Younger men, on average, tend to speak in ways that activate the threat or try-hard response. Over-explaining, hedging excessively, reaching for approval in subtle ways that they themselves are often unaware of. Older men, particularly those who have lived through real things and stopped performing for external validation, tend to speak in ways that simply pass through that filter without resistance. Not because they are trying to, because they have stopped trying. That shift, from performing to simply being, shows up directly in the specific words men choose. And when you understand which words carry that quality, you stop leaving it to chance. So what does this actually look like? The first pattern is not dramatic. In fact, the first time you recognize it, you will realize you have probably used it hundreds of times, just never on purpose. There is a version of confidence that younger men perform. And there is a version that older men simply have. And the difference shows up in a single sentence. Most men hedge when they speak. Not because they are unsure of themselves in any deep sense, but because hedging has become linguistic wallpaper, something layered invisibly over nearly every statement. I think we should maybe we could sort of, I guess if you wanted to, we might. These phrases feel polite. They feel low pressure. They feel safe. And to a woman's subconscious processing, they feel like anxiety wearing a social mask. The female brain is exquisitely sensitive to certainty signals. This is not about arrogance. There is a clear distinction between the two, and women feel it immediately. Arrogance is certainty that needs to be witnessed. Genuine certainty is simply the absence of a specific nervous habit, the habit of softening every statement into a question to avoid the risk of being wrong. What certainty language sounds like in practice is almost plain to the point of boring. We'll go here. I know a place. Leave that with me. No rising inflection at the end, no qualifier before or after, no invitation for the statement to be revised based on her reaction. Now, you might wonder, isn't that just being bossy? And here is where the distinction becomes important. It is not the content of the statement that registers. It is the emotional texture beneath it. A man who says, "I know a good place for this if you're open to it," and delivers it with quiet calm is using certainty language. A man who says the same words while watching her face for approval is using performance language. She cannot always explain the difference, but she feels it every time. One instance of this means very little on its own. It is the pattern of it, the consistency across a conversation, that builds the impression. The man who never reaches for validation in how he phrases things becomes memorable in a way that is genuinely difficult for a woman to articulate after the fact. Certainty tells her you know where you're going. The second word tells her something different. It tells her you've already been somewhere. She doesn't want a man who has all the answers. She wants a man who has clearly lived through some of the questions. There is a specific kind of sentence that older men produce almost naturally, and younger men almost never produce at all. It is a sentence that references the past, not as a story designed to impress, and not as nostalgia draped in sentiment, but as the quiet background radiation of a man who has actually accumulated something, who has seen how things tend to go, who carries that knowledge lightly, the way you carry something you have been holding for a long time. Behavioral researchers who study attraction have noted that women show a measurably different response to men who demonstrate what is sometimes called low reactivity, meaning their emotional and verbal responses are not exaggerated by the situation they are in. A man who says, "That kind of thing used to bother me a lot, I handled it differently then," is not telling a story. He is signaling something specific, that he has been places emotionally that he has already processed and moved through, that he is downstream of certain reactions that younger men are still in the middle of. This lands differently than simply saying you have experience. The phrasing matters precisely because it is not trying to impress. "I've seen that go wrong before" is not a boast. It is an observation from someone who was present and paying attention. I used to think that too, for a long time. Positions experience not as superiority, but as familiarity. And familiarity with difficulty in particular reads as reliability. What makes this work is the absence of performance. The moment a man begins building to a point with his experience, leaning in slightly, raising his voice, watching to see if she is suitably impressed, the signal reverses. She reads enthusiasm for her reaction as the real message, and the experience becomes secondary. The most effective use of this is almost throwaway. Said once, not repeated, not elaborated on unless she asks. Of course, context matters enormously here. Experience markers work because they arise naturally in conversation, when something comes up that genuinely connects to something you have lived through. Manufacturing them, inserting them where they do not belong, produces the opposite effect. She will feel the effort, and effort, in this specific domain, is the thing you are trying to be free of. Experience tells her who you've been. The third word does something more immediate. It tells her what you're actually paying attention to, right now. Most men compliment what they see. A small number of men name what they notice. Those are not the same thing, and women feel the difference immediately. The compliment is everywhere. It has been delivered so often in so many predictable configurations that the female brain processes it almost automatically, receives it, files it, moves on. "You look great. That was funny. You're really smart." These are not wrong. They are simply not rare. And the brain does not linger on what is not rare. What is rare, genuinely rare, is the observation. The specific, unprompted, calm identification of something she did not think anyone noticed. And here is where the psychology becomes particularly interesting. When a woman feels specifically seen, not generically appreciated, but actually observed with precision and attention, something happens in her nervous system that is difficult to describe and almost impossible to ignore. It is connected to a core human need that most people go through large portions of their lives without having fully met. What does this sound like? You said that like you've been sitting on it for a while. You changed the subject right when it was getting interesting. I noticed that. The way you talked about that wasn't casual for you. These sentences cost nothing. They require no preparation. They require only that you are actually paying attention and that you say what you noticed in plain, unhurried language. Before we move forward, there is one layer of this that most explanations skip entirely. The delivery carries as much weight as the content. An observation said with eagerness, leaning forward, hoping she is pleased, tracking her reaction, lands as a compliment wearing a disguise. The same observation delivered with calm, as though you are simply reporting something that seemed worth mentioning, lands as genuine attention. The tone tells her whether this is for you or for her. She is calibrated to know the difference. Remember what I told you at the start, that there were specific words you have already said, probably this week, that landed differently than you expected, and you had no idea why. We are getting very close to understanding why. And the next pattern is where things become most counterintuitive. Noticing her is powerful, but the fourth word works in the opposite direction. It's about what you don't say. The most interesting thing you can do in a conversation isn't add more. Sometimes it's stopping just before she expected you to. Some men tend to over-explain. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply socialized habit. The fear of being misunderstood, of leaving an impression that is incomplete or unclear, pushes most men to keep talking until the point has been fully constructed and delivered with all supporting materials attached. And in most professional contexts, this is reasonable. In conversation with a woman you want to remain on her mind, it is the single most reliable way to ensure you do not. The psychological mechanism here is elegant and straightforward. The brain does not let go of unresolved loops. This is actually a well-documented phenomenon, sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency to remember and mentally return to things that feel incomplete far more than things that have been neatly concluded. When a man provides every answer, closes every thread, and leaves nothing unresolved, her brain processes the conversation as finished. It files it. It moves on. When a man stops just before full resolution, says something that implies depth he did not fully surface, then moves on naturally without fanfare, her brain keeps the thread open. She returns to it. She thinks about what he meant. She finds herself, sometimes hours later, still in a conversation he already left. What does this look like in practice? I'll leave it there. Said calmly, without drama, after a thought that clearly had more to it. That's a conversation for another time. Delivered not as a tease, but as a genuine signal that his interior world has rooms she has not been into. You'd need to know the context. Said once, not elaborated on, followed immediately by something else entirely. You might be thinking, isn't this just withholding? And there is an important distinction here. Withholding is strategic. It is performed. It has an edge of manipulation to it that most women can detect. What works is different. It is the natural behavior of a man who simply has more going on than he is going to unpack in a single conversation. The difference is whether the restraint comes from insecurity or from fullness, from emptiness pretending to be mystery, or from substance that is genuinely not for immediate consumption. 4 words in, and every one of them has been about how you carry yourself inside the conversation. The 5th is different. The 5th is about how you end it. How a conversation ends is how she will remember you. Not how it started, not what happened in the middle. The last thing you said and how you said it is what stays. This is the signal most men have never considered. And it is almost certainly the one you are getting least right. Not because you are doing something wrong exactly, but because you have simply never thought about it as a variable at all. Most men treat the ending of a conversation as a natural fade out, a mutual acknowledgement that the thing is wrapping up, a few words that ease the transition out. Fine, unremarkable, instantly forgettable. There is a well-established principle in social psychology, sometimes called the recency effect. The observation that people's impressions of an experience are disproportionately shaped by how it ends. The ending carries more psychological weight than almost anything that came before it. Applied to conversation, this means that how a man closes an interaction creates an impression that outlasts the content of everything said during it. What most men do is let the ending trail. It softens into vagueness. Well, I should probably get going. It was good to catch up. Take care. These are not bad. They are simply neutral, and neutral endings leave neutral impressions, which is another way of saying no lasting impression at all. What works is different in a very specific way. It is specific. It is calm. And it refers to something that actually happened in the conversation, something that proves he was present for it, not just physically, but mentally. I'll think about what you said about that. Not in a heavy way, said briefly, as a closing fact. That was worth the time. Delivered without any bid for a response, not looking at her afterward to see if she appreciated it, not framing it as a compliment she needs to receive. Simply said and then released. The specificity is what does the work. That was worth the time tells her you were evaluating the conversation, which means you were engaged in it, which means her presence actually registered to you, not as background, not as social obligation, as something worth your time. And time, for a man who is busy and selective, is the clearest signal of genuine attention there is. This also connects to something worth naming directly. A man who can close well, who can be done without trailing, without reaching for one more moment, without softening the exit with unnecessary padding, signals something that is rare and deeply attractive in a quiet way. He signals that he is comfortable with the end, that he is not afraid of what happens after the conversation is over, that he does not need it to keep going in order to feel secure about where things stand. One thing worth noting, the exit line works in exact proportion to how genuinely you mean it. If you did not find the conversation worth your time, saying so will land hollow, and she will feel that hollowness, even if she cannot name it. The skill here is not in constructing the right sentence. It is in actually being present enough during the conversation that a true, specific observation is available to you at the end of it. That is the real practice. Everything else is just the expression of it. 5 words, 5 patterns. And not one of them requires you to be someone you're not. They require you to be more deliberately yourself. When you look back at all 5 of these patterns together, something becomes clear. None of them are tricks, none of them are techniques imported from a place of insecurity and hoping they work well enough to fool someone. Every single one of them is an expression of the same underlying quality. A man who is settled enough in himself that he does not need the conversation to perform a function for his ego. Certainty language is not confident because it sounds strong. It is confident because it stops asking her to validate each statement before the man allows himself to mean it. Experience markers are not attractive because they signal age. They are attractive because they signal processing. A man who has lived through things and come out of the other side without needing to make a dramatic story of it. Observation language is not powerful because it is flattering. It is powerful because it is rare. The simple, uncommon act of actually paying attention and saying so without needing a particular response. Strategic restraint is not interesting because it creates mystery as a strategy. It is interesting because it is the natural signature of a man with depth, a man who has more going on than he needs any single conversation to contain. And the exit line is not memorable because it is well constructed. It is memorable because it is specific and honest and delivered without agenda. The overarching principle underneath all of this is simple. Women are not attracted to men who are trying hard to be attractive. They are drawn, often without being able to explain why, to men who seem to have simply stopped needing to try. That quality shows up directly in language, in specific word choices, in what gets said, what gets held back, and how conversations begin and end. You do not need to overanalyze this. In fact, overanalyzing it is the thing most likely to undo it. The value of understanding these patterns is not so that you can engineer each sentence from the outside. It is so that you can recognize when you are naturally doing this and when you are drifting away from it and make a quiet adjustment. Which of these 5 have you used without realizing it, and what happened? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this channel is new to you, what you will find here is exactly this kind of conversation, the real psychology behind how women think, explained plainly, without agenda, for men who want to actually understand rather than just be handed a script. Subscribe if that is the kind of insight you want more of. And in the next video, I'm going to show you something that might be even more important than what you say. Why women remember the feeling of a conversation long after they've forgotten the words, and what that means for every interaction you have from here forward.